Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thanks so much for listening. I want to give a special thank you to Martin Bernal Hafner for his donation, for your donation, Martin. Thank you so much. If you guys want to learn about Martin and what he's doing with wine, I actually interviewed him for an episode, so just look back. His winery is Alta Orsa. You can learn a lot about what he's doing, which is very cool, with regenerative farming in Mendocino and making some delicious wine there. If you would like to support this podcast and the work of spreading ecological and regenerative awareness in the wine industry and how wine can be part of the solution to some of our biggest problems, you can Venmo a donation to @Centralis. That's @CENTRALAS. It's associated with my name, Adam Huss, and it's greatly appreciated and will help me prioritize the enormous amount of time and energy that goes into producing each episode. Thank you so much. In this episode, I get to talk to the co-founders and winemakers for RAS Wines, Dan Roche, Joe Appel, and Emily Smith. Dan, Joe, and Emily make a dry sparkling wine from Maine wild blueberries. And we talk about some of the incredible aspects of this unique wine culture. Maine wild blueberries are one of the few fruits indigenous to and perfectly suited to the challenging terroir of Maine. Even though they occur naturally, thus the wild aspect, they are actively tended as a commercial crop. I'm fascinated by this kind of agriculture, which shows a way that we humans can integrate with natural ecosystems and be instrumental to their health and vitality, while also using them to support our own health and survival. Working with and selling wine made from fruit that isn't grapes, and for which consumers have many preconceptions, has given Dan, Joe, and Emily some profound insights into wine. They want us to ask ourselves, is what we think we know about wine actually limiting our experience of it? They've realized how much we need to unlearn, and they are part of a domestic wine scene that is locally based, resourceful, creative, as diverse as the land that they make wine from, and, in my opinion, one of the most exciting parts of wine today. As they say, we don't expect wine made from Cab Franc to taste like a grape, so why do we have different expectations for blueberries? I'm excited to share these winemakers with you and the unique world of Maine wild blueberries that they're helping to share through their wine. Enjoy. Emily, Dan, Joe, thanks so much for joining. Welcome.
Thanks for having us. We're happy to be here.
It's very nice to be here.
You guys have a really fun project, and I'm really excited to learn about it. So could you just start by telling us what that project is and where it is, and then how you guys got there?
All right, those are good questions. So I'll start, and my compadres here can fill in. We started RAS Wines in the late fall of 2019, and we are based in southern Maine. Our winery itself is in Portland, Maine, actually in the city environs there. We grow no fruit. We are committed to making wine from only fruit that is raised organically in Maine. And for that, right now at least, we're working exclusively with Maine wild blueberries. And we can talk a lot more about what that actual species of fruit is like. We work, well, when we started, we were working with 2 growers. We've now worked with a total of 4 different growers. And in the state of Maine, which is surprisingly big for those who don't live here in the area, there are a number of different wild blueberry regions. And so we work with growers from all of those different regions. Some are not even 2 hours north of Portland, right along the coast, basically, in an area called the Mid-Coast. And then it goes all the way up into an area called Down East, which can be a misleading term because it's not really down anywhere. It's the far northeastern tip of the United States. We work with a grower there, right near a stone's throw from the border with Canada. So we buy fruit exclusively from these organic growers, and I don't
Make
know.
wine.
And we make
We
wine.
make wine out of it.
We somehow press it into juice and it ferments, so it counts as wine.
Yeah.
So you also asked about how we get started, and we could go into that more now.
Yeah,
Or
yeah. Well, I mean, I would love to know sort of how you formed this troupe of winemakers with your various skills and what the values are really, as much as how that happened. But what are the values that have led you to want to work with organically grown fruit and specifically these these blueberries?
Yeah, so I'll try to take that one. We basically all three of us met working for a kind of small local grocery chain in the Portland area. So Dan and Joe, I think, started there. What year, Joe? Was it
I started there in '05. Dan
maybe
came in '07.
'07? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we all met like working in various capacities there, and kind of the focus of that chain is not only local produce but like conscientiously created foods, foods that are made to, I don't know, from bottom to top, be, you know sustainably crafted, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So we all, like, living in that environment, got to know each other and all found ourselves there because of that kind of shared value that food should be something that is, made with care, should come from land that is tended with care, that it's more than just something you eat.
Mhm.
And
Also, I'll just jump in to say, with a real strong focus on local farms and agriculture. So
yeah.
getting in as much as we could from farms right around us.
And Maine is really unique because it actually has like a small to mid-sized farm population. Like a lot, and across the country, a lot of those kind of that size scale of farming is disappearing. But Maine is actually a place that has a really, really strong local agriculture sector, which is cool, and I think something that definitely drew Dan and Joe here, or kept them here at least. I grew up here, but yeah, so Dan and Joe were both, Joe more so like very, very instrumental in the wine buying program there. He was the head wine buyer, I think, at the time that we ended up starting this company. And Dan was general manager, and I kind of wore a lot of hats, from at one point being produce manager to marketing. It's a small business, so you end up doing lots.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we all became good friends there, and I think that the values of that particular company helped, craft and bring us together around thinking about wine in that way. And I think Joe
You
can
know
speak
what?
a little more to the wine, the focus of wine there, and how that kind of led
Yeah,
to
I mean, as you, I'm gonna intrude here, just as you're
these.
about to go into
No.
that transition, hopefully give you a segue to talk about that, because you aren't the first winemakers on this podcast who started in sort of co-ops or grocery stores and at some form that were the sort of that kind of local organic produce style of and had whole sort of first careers in that before transitioning to wine, or even in farmers market like this. There is this, I guess what I'm saying is that there is a theme now for sure of this connection between working in produce and seeing where your produce is coming from and then making this connection to wine. And I'm really fascinated by that. I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about why there might be that theme among winemakers, especially doing the kind of work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, I think you've set that up really well. I think that it's obvious to us, by whom I mean myself, Emily, Dan, but also you and plenty of others, that when we talk about this sort of revolution that's happened over the past, whatever you want to say, decade or two, in terms of people trying to pay a lot more attention to where their food comes from, the conditions under which it's grown, and all of that. Um, it it's just felt intuitive and obvious to us that wine is a part of that.
Wine is food.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that
Yeah.
historically it was that. Another thing we'll get into is, how these distinctions we have among different fermented beverages are sort of a modern construct as well, between beer and wine and cider and
Right.
other ferments. It's like it's all just it's all just a modern
It's much
construct.
more fluid than that, pardon the
Yeah,
pun.
of course. Yeah. And but I think like one of the reasons actually, so in heading up the wine program at this small group of markets Emily was describing, it was sort of over time rather frustrating that these people who are customers, and even people we know who weren't our customers or who bought food elsewhere, like paid so much attention to the food that they bought, but then they kind of wouldn't care about the wine. Um, so I think we took it on ourselves in moving the wine program along to say, even though this was true. Our wines really were, I don't know, 95% from Europe. They were small scale farming. They were people we actually increasingly got to know through our relationships with a small handful of really good importers. Through visits, we were lucky enough to be able to take to the wineries themselves in those wine producing countries in Europe. And we noticed that the relationships we had with the chicken guy and our dairy farmers and our vegetable growers at this place in Maine, like those, the same attitudes were being expressed by these winemakers. Going back again, like to many customers, just not, it was just very hard for them to see that connection. So we, yes, were bringing in wine that was shipped in containers across the Atlantic Ocean, but it was still made on that scale, and with that spirit in mind. And so there was I don't know, we just felt really compelled to draw that connection more closely. That's not the only reason we got into this winemaking project,
We love wine.
but yeah, that's one of the primary reasons, right? Is that we really love wine, and I think people get into wine from all sorts of directions, and you can get through it obviously just like gustatorially, right? Like this is my taste, I love this thing. You can get into it for as many winemakers as you've described getting into it through farmers markets and agriculture, and that there are winemakers who get into it because they're chemists or they're engineers, or like there are a lot of ways in. There are plenty of people we know who get into wine from like being poets, and so there's like there's the aesthetic component. There's if we can ever get Dan in here, I think of the three of us, Dan is the most intense just geography lover and
Mm,
like obsessive enthusiast of what the globe is like and what movement over time by peoples and tribes and groups looks like, and what how countries relate to each other. Like that's a huge part of wine. So
yeah.
people get into it from all sorts of ways. I will go back to what Emily said, like we love drinking wine, but when we decided, okay, here's this part of it that we haven't yet done, which is make it, um, how can we do that in a way where we're not buying fruit from a long way away, or even as some people do, buying juice? Like how can we do it truly respectful of terroir, and we live in a cold climate in one of the northernmost states in the country? Like how do we
Yeah.
do that? How do we focus on terroir? And so for better or for worse, like we now have this fruit here that's been here for more than 10,000 years. And
Yeah.
we can talk about how the fruit got to be here, but it was like, okay, we're going to work with this fruit and see what it shows us about where we live.
Do you guys know, is it, so I did a little research for other reasons about the Vikings first landing, and they sort of came in Nova Scotia area, not too far from Maine, and declared it Vinland, this whole
Mm,
Yeah,
idea.
yes.
yeah.
And but I think it wasn't because they saw these wild vines. I mean, that might have been part of it, but I think it was like berries. Like there was this abundance of berries that they could turn into
Mm.
wine. Do you know about any of that? Have you heard about that?
That's really interesting. The berry thing is probably true. I do know that when I've seen talk of Vinland and those discoveries, that part of it was vitis. It wasn't vinifera, but it was vitis. So
Right, of
it
course it
was
wasn't. Yeah.
Aria.
Yeah.
And so I think they were seeing not just fruit generically, but um, you know grapes, actual grapes.
Okay.
But going
Okay.
back to this thing that I was saying before, like they saw a land that could produce something that would be made into wine, which at the time
Right.
was not limited to grapes.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's yeah, I've actually swum to Maine. It's not too long
Um,
of a swim if you're swimming from New Hampshire uh, across
oh,
across a lake.
Wow, I
that's
thought
like
you did a whole
from
like
Nova
Panama
Scotia.
Canal kind of thing. Yeah.
No, my father's from New Hampshire, and so we would spend summers on a lake there right on the border, and so I could swim to Maine. That was like the fun
Nice.
little thing. Now,
He
and this
just
does bring
dropped
up
you
some.
on one side of the boat, you swim under the boat, and you were in Maine. Was that?
Yeah, pretty much. No, I mean it wasn't that big of a lake where I could like leap off a dock, and it was probably only a half mile or a quarter mile across. So at a certain place where I think where we were.
Yeah, ditto.
Yeah.
I mean it I was young and it was all fun and whatever. The only scary thing is when you're out in the middle and it's super deep, and then motorboats start coming. Then you're you're
That's what I was
like
gonna say. Boat traffic. My number one concern for you was boat traffic.
yes, exactly. Um, and it is brings up the question, a very important question. Why don't any of you have the accent?
Huh. That's
Well,
a good
Dan and
question.
I are from away. I'll let Emily speak because she's native.
I don't know why I don't have the accent. Probably because I probably wouldn't be declared a true Mainer by a true Mainer because my parents are not from Maine. So my dad is from Massachusetts, my mom is from Buffalo, and I think for that reason I'm accent free, but accents also seem to go, they're a little more rurally based here, and I am from just outside the Portland area, so could be a little bit of that. I consider myself a Mainer for the record.
Yeah.
Got it. And my final sort of local color question: have you guys listened to Bert and I? Have you
No.
ever discovered Bert and I?
No.
What a
Wait.
treasure trove you have to discover. Check out.
Educate us.
Yeah, just look up Bert and I. I'm sure it's now the recordings are on YouTube or somewhere like that. But it is literally Maine humor. It's anyway, Bert and I. Anybody, guys should try it. It's a whole fun thing for you to do.
Well, when you have us back, we'll have the accents, the jokes, the whole thing ready for
beautiful. So RAS, your last names, and I'm guessing you didn't do it alphabetical because it would be ARS, and that would not be appropriate.
That's true.
That's very true. That was a consideration.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
We came dangerously close to a couple of off-color LLC names. But
I love it.
Doing business as RAS Wines.
I love it.
Yeah,
so
things are so tricky. We kind of we didn't want to go with anything that was, I don't know. It's such a hard choice to pick a name because it's like a very fine line to walk of not sounding too like contrived or I don't know, just insincere. And so we're like, we wanted wines that were going to be timeless, and I don't know, and thought to ourselves that who we are that's something that's constant, and that's like, I don't know, our values are what are behind our wines, so why not just go simple and clear, our initials. Our only regret is that people think it's Ross, and there's nothing we can do about that.
Ross? Wait,
Ross? Like Ross Wines.
Like they think we're Rastafarians, or they're
no.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
They read Ross.
Yeah, they just say
Ross,
like
okay.
Ross, Raz. Like people just don't. We have to.
We've added some dots. We've added some dots between the R and the
new
A
labels
and
have dots.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were inspired by Koss, the Sicilian winemakers. And because that's those three initials are the three initials of the last names of the principals there, and we just adore those wines. So, but they're not COS. Like everyone says Koss about that winery. So I don't know.
Yeah, don't fight it. You'll probably be fighting unnecessarily. It's probably not the battle that's worth fighting.
Yeah.
If people know you for that and love you for that.
Yeah.
probably so many other ones to fight in terms of, making the kind of wine that you guys are making. You
Yeah.
don't need that one. And maybe not. I mean, how is your wine embraced locally and in otherwise? Has it, I mean, do you find that it's a struggle? Like, I mean, I still hear from cider makers that selling cider is very difficult. Are you guys experiencing the same kind of difficulty, or is it such a novelty that people are like, oh, blueberry wine, that's interesting, let me try this?
No, it's definitely a challenge. I think there's an element in being from Maine and having it be a Maine product that does help us to sell it, certainly locally and certainly during tourist season. But in terms of that like year-round market, yeah, it's difficult because there's a level of education that has to go into the sale. You know, it's a new thing. Is it
Yeah,
wine? Is it cider? Is it, people are think a lot of the times because it's a fruit wine that it's going to be sweet, but
yeah,
it's very dry, and so yeah, I think we're part of what we need to do and are working to do is to kind of get people to try it,
Hmm.
educate people as
Mhm.
to what it is, and kind of open their minds to the idea that wine is not something that needs to necessarily be exclusively made from grapes. And
Mhm.
that's, I mean, we're fortunate enough to work with a lot of people, um, people both in Maine and, a few other states that are working to kind of shift that mindset that people have around like what constitutes wine. And so I think in that way, we're fortunate because our timeline of making this wine and forming this company is kind of coinciding with a greater movement in the wine world, especially like in the States for um, a domestic wine scene. Is that what I'm trying to say? Where people are expanding like beyond vinifera, beyond grapes into other beverages that have alcohol.
Mhm. Yeah.
I love that.
The only thing I would
Yeah,
add is that it's, that the education process that Emily is talking about usually, in our experience, also involves first sort of like a de-education or like there's all these
right.
preconceptions that people have. So
Yeah.
like before you can say try this or before it can be like hey expand what you know, there has to be a little bit of first take a moment to observe what you know and how it's sort of limiting your and like set aside whatever you think about when you have a prejudicial notion of fruit wines, set aside like the notion of blueberries, set it whatever it is, I mean people
Yeah.
still sort of make nervous pancakes jokes when you like like first open the bottle and it's like you know like you know what? Like Cabernet Franc doesn't taste like a grape. Why would this wine taste like a blueberry? You know. Um,
That
so
is really well. That's a great point that I don't think. Yeah, that's fantastic. Um, you mean people are like, is it going to smell like blueberry pancakes when they pop the
yeah,
bottle,
well,
or they're
oh, I mean, I think that there is a history of wine from fruits, and in this country that has usually been, or at least with a fruit like the wild blueberry, which maximum bricks is like 12 or 13. So you're getting like 6% alcohol in a dry wine. Um,
right?
that leads to a wine with whatever its flavors is sort of like texture wise pretty you know, maybe two dimensional is unfair to it, but you like thinner, And so in the past, the way to deal with that has either been to chapitalize it or to add sugar afterwards to sort of mimic a, a 13% vinifera based wine. And I'll go further and say the people historically doing that, I think their personal tastes, as far as I know from, and there are exceptions, we can talk about the exceptions, but most people getting into it, making wine from wild blueberries, like their personal tastes are for, let's say, Californian wines from a generation ago, like sort of over manipulated, um, big in body, sort of blousy, like old school kind of crappy wine. And so those people who want like you know, a Merlot from 1997 are going to do whatever they need to do to a wine from Blueberries to try to make it mimic that. So you fast forward to us, and when we encounter people who are like, they've had those wines, the sort of like faux Merlots. So they're like, wait, why is your wine not like that? That's what a fruit wine is. That's what a blueberry wine is. Like all of that kind of stuff. So when I talk about, I'm using a bad word, but de-education, whatever it is, you know, there's that sort of narrative that we need to dismantle a little bit before we can just say, okay, now blank slate, try this wine.
I mean, I just, yeah, I think that's such a great point. I mean, I actually make that point when I give talks about my journey through viticulture and winemaking. That so much of it, so much of my, learning is actually unlearning. So many of my, yeah, I mean, life is like that, I guess, a process of unlearning the things you thought you knew. Um,
Yeah.
and so it makes sense, especially with this and with just getting people out there. I mean, I know that there is an audience for exactly what you're doing who love it and embrace it. Myself is included in that. And then there's uh, everyone else, because I'm kind of niche. There our
Mhm.
our audience is kind of niche at the moment. Um, and my parents would be confused by this wine, for example. They would want it to be, yeah, they would expect sweetness. They would want sweetness. They like a little sweetness.
We say that, by the way, we are great lovers of wines with balanced sweetness.
Yes, me too.
Uh,
Yeah.
there's nothing against sweetness. I think it's what you're talking about. It's sort of, it's against, yeah, the assumption.
Well, I would love to hear more about, just that terroir, where these are growing, what it looks like. I mean, when I see pictures, the few pictures on your website, I think people expect to see, I mean, out here in California, we have blueberry places that if anybody pays attention to them, they're these giant fields covered with nets. and um and then there's bushes on mounds, and they're green bushes surrounded by brown dirt. And if you look at the photos from your website, it just sort of looks like a meadow with no bushes at all, and it's red. Can you
Yeah.
sort of describe that process of unlearning as well? What's it really like out there in the wild blueberry patches?
Yeah, well, so the photos on our website we really love, but they were taken in autumn, so that's part of the
Okay,
reason for the redness. It doesn't
got it.
look
Yeah.
like that in June, um, but so this is, as you know, we try to never say that we're making wine from blueberries. They are Maine wild blueberries. It's really its own fruit. So all of your experiences you're saying in California or elsewhere, it's a totally different fruit. Um,
Right.
so the wild blueberry is truly wild in that it's not planted. It was, as we sometimes say, our vineyards were planted about 10,000 years ago by birds. And
Yeah.
that's basically true. Like it's just wild and growing. They grow, most people in Maine know a distinction between low bush and high bush wild blueberries.
Uh-huh.
Um, and we work with low bush, which are very low, like, don't come over above your knee, just growing on the ground. And that's part of their, um, how they developed to protect themselves against a very harsh climate, is just to stay
Mm.
low. Um, and the wild blueberry is much smaller than any cultivated blueberry. So if you get a supermarket blueberry, it's like that big plump thing,
Yeah.
um, that has quite a bit of water in it. And so the sort of skin to juice ratio of a cultivated berry is all wrong for winemaking. It might be nice
Yeah.
on your cereal or, granola or whatever, but the wild blueberry has a much smaller skin to juice ratio, and a really intense flavor. Um, as I alluded to in my bricks comment, it's sweet when it's a ripe fruit, but it's got a lot of acidity.
Mhm.
And so just naturally, it has that sort of balance between acidity, mostly based on acetic acid, and sugar. And yeah, they just grow in these fields that here in Maine by the growers are called barrens, a really sort of resonant word, because
That's what the
as you're describing those photos on the website, like it does look sort of bleak. But it's not bleak. I mean, when you're in the fields, it's really cool, but it certainly doesn't look like a row of grapevine.
So these are the blueberry barrens?
Yes, the wild blueberry
Like,
barrens of Maine.
and this is Barren, not Baron, like as
Oh,
in
right. Yeah. Yeah. We
the American
personally are
tycoons.
blueberry
You're
barons.
the barons.
We're with a
Yes.
no, no, no. Yeah, yeah. Barrens.
Got it.
Yeah, yeah.
That is fun. I love that. I mean, that's lovely. I like that idea.
It's cool. One
Um,
the I mean, not to keep going on the website, but those
no, please do. I have more
those
questions.
pictures
Yeah.
are taken at this farm we work with. That this is the one on the Canadian border, um, and those like if the camera panned a little bit to the right, you would see the Atlantic Ocean right there. So
Wow.
right, it's right on that rocky coast. All of that land came into existence as glaciers receded. So they are called glacial moraines, and
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's just the ice receding as the Earth warmed up a little bit about 12,000 years ago, and this is the fruit that was well suited to it.
And if I remember correctly, I mean they are well suited because the soil is extremely sandy. It's extremely acidic. Is that correct? Or am I wrong? Extremely rocky.
I
What is
think
it
it's
that
all
why do they thrive there? What is the what? How have they found a niche?
Um, at least for me, I think we're getting to the very limits of my geological know-how. But I think everything you said is correct. It's actually depending on where we are, it's all granite based, but
Hmm.
the topsoil is sometimes sandy and sometimes clay based. So sometimes more inland, it's clay. Um,
Okay.
so, but everything else you said, I think is completely accurate. But I just don't know. Yeah, as I say, I don't know how. I don't know why, botanically speaking, a wild blueberry, or like botanically or chemically, I don't know why this fruit is well suited to soils of this nature.
Okay. It's
But you're right,
it
very
would it,
acidic soils. Yeah,
it would be considered a poor soil, a marginal soil at best in other forms of agriculture,
yeah,
if
yeah,
I'm not mistaken.
yeah,
So
Hence
it's
the
kind
name
of
Baron.
yeah, yeah.
right.
There's yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, there nothing else grows there, and so it works out
Right.
that there's blueberries. But all it is rocky, big old glacial erratic rocks that are left behind, and very little topsoil, just sand. And
Mhm.
yeah, nothing else grows there except blue.
Right.
So rocky, in fact, that most of the fruit we get cannot be machine harvested. Um, and it's the
Right.
word. I mean, it is harvesting, but everyone here uses the word raked because they are raked off the bushes with hand rakes. There, you can do some machine raking of the flatter fields,
Right.
many of which mechanically have had rocks removed. But as Dan is saying, yeah, it's a lot of bumpy, rocky, just hills and dales.
And I guess what I'm getting at is this seems a really great example of a plant that is adapted to this extreme and poor environment for other crops that you guys have are showcasing how to turn it into something transcendent and beautiful. And that I don't know, there's something really lovely about that. There's being able to use marginal land for wine to me is a really good use of marginal land. um, and I don't know if you have any comments about that, but it's just something that I admire and find really uh, fascinating, especially about this little niche of the world.
When we first were developing business plans and launching this project, the sort of 10-year goal was to have planted vines in Maine for grapes. Start with blueberries and use that as a springboard. And
Yeah.
it's not totally off the table. But the more I think we learned about the industry of blueberries, the history, and just the story and the place, I think it spoke to us in the same way you're sort of remarking upon. Is that it's just like what a perfect like example of something that you can use that doesn't tax the climate that is naturally there, that's existed for so long. It's kind of a good story, and it's an interesting thing to do, and just it fits if
Yeah.
Maine, and if we can make something
Right.
people like, then it's all the better. And and we're not we're not using like not planting or using any resources for that. It's just there, and it has weathered the changes in the climate and history and time for 10,000 years. So it's adapted and it's there, and
Yeah,
it should be
that's
used. And unfortunately, it's struggling. The industry is struggling, and so there's needs to be more sort of viability and adaptation by the people that are using the land to keep that industry alive.
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I think that's well, and you're part of that, right?
Yeah,
We're trying to,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Helping to
Although
tell the story and
I do want to say, like, it's very kind of you, Adam, to have said what you've said about our project, but it's not as if we're the first ones to do something with with this amazing fruit. You know, if we weren't here, it's dying, because there is an industry that rakes those berries, and those berries are, consumed. And we can talk a little
right.
bit more about that. But the fruit has been used, I mean, obviously originally by the indigenous people of this land. And there are still indigenous Wabanaki tribes people who do some of the tending and growing of wild blueberries. There is this industry, and we're just sort of coming along to do our thing and participate in it. The wine industry is part of what we're helping to sort of really grow, but the wild blueberry industry more broadly was here, a long time before we got here.
Sure. Yeah. No. And yes, I don't mean to give you undue credit, but I do like what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah,
I know other people are making wine from the blueberries as well, but
yeah, yeah, true.
it's and it is it's part of the story. You're part of that story, and I guess that's what I'm saying. I really like to draw attention to these the fact that you're part of a story that's much bigger than you, and in a way, what you said underlines that you had this initial thought, as I think many of us do, myself included, of I think wanting to maybe impose is too strong because it comes from a good place, but we have an idea of the kind of thing that we want to do in a place, and over time we begin to realize, oh, that's just my you know my ego, my whatever it is, that is so much less important than this thing that is millennia old, that I am fortunate to be able to participate in, that transcends my lifetime. And you just become you stop seeing yourself in this uh, I hate to use the word impose, because again, I'm not saying not to critique that, because I think we all intend and impose, and we all tend and impose our wills, and can do so beneficially on nature if we are careful and thoughtful. But it's this different thing of listening versus bringing your own intent to it, versus listening and finding what the intent of that land is. And I think it seems like you are going through that process. Yeah, so that's more what I meant.
Yeah, yeah, no, well put.
So I would love you guys to talk a little bit about what that winemaking process is like with the harvesting. I mean, if I understand correctly, you're pretty much, since you're making a sparkling beverage with this, a dry sparkling beverage, are you doing anything to it besides? I mean, I'm sure you're doing a lot to it. But anyway, let's talk about your winemaking. I was gonna say, I don't think you're adding anything at all, right? It's just blueberries that end up being the ingredient that makes your beverage.
Yeah, correct. The start is when the harvest occurs. We get in touch with our growers and farmers, and we bring our fermenters to the farm. And blueberries, they pick them into these 20-pound boxes, and so there's just pallets of 20-pound boxes that we dump into the fermenters. They're about just shy of a ton fermenters, and then we bring them back to the winery. And then the first thing we do is we just jump in the fermenters and stomp them, just move,
Uh-huh.
get the juice flowing, move them around. And we do that maybe a couple times. And then first vintage, longer maceration, second vintage, shorter. And this year was a little bit shorter than that. So it started 30 days, which ended up being too long. The second vintage was about 2 weeks. And then this past vintage that we finished in August would average about maybe 7 days, so a week maceration.
Oh, and that's the fermentation as well. Like that's before pressing, essentially from
That's
crush to
before, yeah.
press.
So that's before pressing. So we just let them. We stomp and did some pump over and some stomp down, and we just left them in the fermenters for an average of 7 days. The big issue is we have to get to the farms, and we only have so much space and there's only so many fermenters. So we have to sort of manage our space and how we're using it. So some fermenters get pressed early, some a little bit later, so we can get empty fermenters and go back to the farm and pick up more fruit. And so, so about 7 days of fermenting on the skins, which just takes off naturally once we jump in and stomp them. It seems to get that going pretty quickly. And then, and then we press, just like I don't know the size, but a large bladder press. And that's it. And then it goes straight into just neutral vessels. And that's
And
sort of
the fermenters aren't connected to any temperature control or anything. They're
no,
just
everything is they're just
We wish.
these they're called stay
Oh,
plats. They're just like insulated large plastic. They're used in the fishing industry a lot for bait and for
got
lobster
it.
like that.
Got it. These aren't
But
used,
yeah,
are they?
We're
no,
natural.
they're not only used by blueberries.
Yeah.
So
Got
there's
it. Got it. Okay.
no technology whatsoever there.
Yeah.
And even after we press, we're pressing into just no tech vessels at the moment.
Got it.
And so it's
No, I think that's great. Yeah.
it's going to just
And
get
then do you?
a bit high on the fermentation, but we don't control that at all at this point.
Well, I mean, you're talking to somebody who's fermenting outdoors in Los Angeles at times when it's 90 degrees. So I think you guys probably have cool fermentations relative to that.
Yeah, true.
I mean,
our fermentations sometimes get done in 3 days. So
these fermenters are they're so well insulated that can be good and bad, but it can get pretty hot. But it can also keep if fruit is like picked on a cold day, so it can insulate, and we can get pretty high temperatures or pretty low temperatures. We can slow the fermentation down, or at least slow the starting of it. But there's nothing added. The only time we add anything is at the when we bottle, so our tirage. So we add a few grams of sugar per bottle.
Oh, okay. So you're not using more blueberry juice to restart the fermentation.
No, we kick around these ideas and we've talked about it, but we've yet to get into that. Like we've yet to do any R&D on that, so we don't quite know yet. But it's always a conversation. But when it does come time to bottle, we've yet to take that step.
We hope to get there.
But we have had some conversations with champagne producers that have toyed around with other sweeteners and have come to the conclusion, without any real scientific backing up, but just from experiential, is that sugar seems to provide them the best flavor after secondary fermentation. But we haven't tried anything else. But so right now it's just organic sugar.
Got it. Yeah. I've done a little of both. I'm torn. I don't know if I've done such extreme different things. Like I did orange juice was one of my.
Wow.
I fermented orange juice and then added orange juice to re-ferment, and it worked out really well. But I couldn't tell you if it was significantly different than the sugar ones that were done that way.
And we're our hope is for our wine Arcadia is to avoid disgorging, and so we're sort of anxious enough about hitting that sort of bullseye that allows us to get enough pressure in the bottle without needing to disgorge.
Yeah, without a ton of.
With sugar, we have a better understanding of what that looks like. And then every time we've experimented, when you get to that point of the year in late winter when you want to experiment, you can make bottles with blueberry concentrate. Or we haven't, but every test I do with sugar, even, you don't really understand the result of that test for a couple months, and you don't really have a couple months to wait when it comes to bottling, because one, we're not using any yeast. We're not doing any yeast addition. So we sort of, if I do a test run of bottles and I wait 2 months, I don't know what the activity of that yeast in the rest of the wine is 2 months later. It might have changed enough to alter what the outcome would be.
Right.
And so
how
sugar
long,
at least allows us to.
If you don't mind, if you don't want to share proprietary secrets, that's fine. But I'm very curious, if you're willing to share, how long do you wait after the juice goes dry before you do the tirage?
We're doing it in late March, early April.
Oh, and when are you harvesting?
Of the same. So it depends. Years differ the last few vintages, but in August, either this year was early.
Wow.
But part of that,
the juice has been still for a while then. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
it's been
But
it's
again,
been
like
fermenting.
that bullseye we're trying to hit is like just allowing the sediment to settle as much as possible to clarify the wine,
Right,
because
right.
don't
No, I totally get that. Yeah, so you're letting it
they are
settle, and then you're even after all that time adding sugar, it just re-ferments, it kicks off.
it has so far, yeah.
Right, right.
That
Gotcha.
anxiety,
2 vintages in.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
that it's
yeah,
really
someday you may end up with a still sweet wine, which would be
yeah.
lovely, lightly sweet.
It'll be delicious,
Please,
honestly.
dear Lord. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just that mark of like the goalpost that's moving of like, have we clarified? Has it settled enough? And is the yeast still active enough? And then picking that right amount of tirage to not, not leave too much sediment to then have gushing bottles. Our first vintage, we went on our tirage was too high, and we ended up having to disgorge after we'd already released the wine and labeled it. So it was not all of the wine, but a fair portion of the wine was on the market, and all of the wine was labeled. And then we ended up having to buy it all back and disgorge throughout the summer, like to order.
Oh, wow.
We'll send you some
4
photos.
cases a day in our backyard.
It was
Yeah.
challenging.
It was cool.
Yeah, no, I've been there. Totally been there. I don't know if you've had the experience yet. I don't wish it upon you, but where you've over tiraged or and then you basically have a bunch of leaky bottles that when you disgorge, you lose like more than a third of the juice because the pressure is so great it just explodes. But just yeah, don't.
We
That's
had leaks,
that's
but we were definitely losing wine upon
A
opening.
large volume of wine.
Yeah.
yeah. So what is the wine like then? I mean, I know I think everybody should just try it. But I would love to. Well, actually, I have a question before you talk about what it tastes like. You mentioned it was high in acetic acid, and that would seem to be like for us, in the grape world, like a VA potential issue. Can you talk about that?
It's an issue.
Okay. You have
So,
to be on top of it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, Dan talked about how that first vintage we did like, roughly an average of 30 days on skins before we pressed the fruit. The main problem with that was it just allowed quite a bit of acetobacter to build up,
Got it.
and it wasn't the problem wasn't as much as it might be with other fruit like oxidization,
Uh-huh.
because while blueberries are so naturally high in antioxidants, that oxygen really isn't quite the issue. It's that yeah, all that acetic acid just had more time to build up. And I think that wine, which is the 2020 vintage, and still available in some markets, and if people wanted to, it's available for sale on our website, along with the 2021. Some people still order the 2020 because they like it, but it definitely betrays the VA.
Yeah.
So as we went forward into 2021, and now just a month ago with 2022, reducing the time on skins, doing a little more pump over, sort of being a little more active, in turn, just to keep the buildup of all that acetic, to keep that at
Yeah.
bay, was definitely
Yeah.
so. Yeah.
I mean, that's where I would imagine CO2 management comes into play, where you, again, if you're waiting that long amount of time, then a lot of that CO2 is blown off in the
Right.
fermenter, and you're getting a lot more oxidation, which is great for acetobacter,
Yeah.
versus keeping like a CO2 blanket on. Is that what you're finding? Like, or
Yeah.
keeping it CO2 rich is part of that early, making these moves earlier in the process helps keep it a little more CO2 rich before it goes to tank, where it will be a little less exposed to oxygen.
Yeah, certainly the shortening that time in the fermenters is helped with the getting the fermentation starting quicker, and then leaving them in the fermenters for a short period of time helped us with the acetic. Also, just learning from mistakes and keeping topped up more. And then we
Right.
use argon now in the tanks to top up or to keep
Okay.
blanket on top of the wine,
Oh, nice. Okay. Got it.
which we're just starting to experiment with this vintage.
Mhm.
And then we're also toying, like, we're not probably going to do it now, but just when we actually bottle, because the earlier we bottle, the less risk we have, obviously. But then again, it's that target of like,
Yeah, the clarity
yeah,
target.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And right now, though, again, like, so
CT.
unlike if we were working with grapes, we would be harvesting later into the year where the temperatures would be coming down naturally outside. But because we're in August, our harvest is in August, where our ambient temperature in the winery is higher, so the wine itself is not being brought down to like cooler temperatures after fermentation right away. So
Yes.
hopefully in the future we have the opportunity to get better equipment that would allow us to manage that time when it's still August and it's still 85, 88 degrees outside. We could
Right.
do a better job of getting the wine down to a healthy temperature. Right now, it's that management includes opening the garage door in the morning or at night and leaving it open when it's 55 degrees out. So then, naturally we can,
Right.
which is a much more sustainable option than pumping.
Right. But yeah, I mean, we imagine those summers aren't going to get any cooler for a while. So yeah, probably need to. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something I'm thinking about a lot now too. That temperature. I mean, because temperature again does increase that oxidation rate, increases the Acetobacter proliferation potential. And it does, yeah. And if you're harvesting warm fruit, especially, I'm sure the barons are getting baked in those days. Do you harvest like the way that grapes get harvested, like early morning, or sort of shooting for the coolest part of the day, or night harvesting? I guess you probably would be insane to do night harvesting with blueberries.
They just harvest throughout the day.
Yeah, I mean
Okay.
it's out of our hands at that point.
Yeah.
I
Got
mean,
it.
I mean, now we get into issues that I'm sure you're facing as well. Of like labor has gotten really hard, especially during the pandemic, but even now. So it's like to finally like get their crew all ready to go, and then say, no, actually, let's have you wait until 9 p.m. Might
Well, and what those crews, what they're picking for, 99% of what they're picking for is going to a freezer line, a pack line, where it's just going to get frozen within a day.
Mm-hmm.
And then the tiny 1% is going to retail, like to fresh pack, they call it. So those people will
Farmers
drive
market.
down to the farmer's market every other day during the month of August. And those blueberries are being sold within 2 days of being picked and consumed within 4 days of being picked. So it's not they're not harvesting with any broader scope than that. Not certainly not what grape farmers would be thinking. It's just it's immediate consumption or immediate freezing. And so nobody has the capacity to keep fruit cold or to really manage a crew in that way here.
By the way, the number that Dan just gave you were not picked out of a hat. It is truly 99% of all wild blueberries that are picked go straight to the freezer process. So we're working with the 1% that's left.
Wow. So there's a great potential for growth. That's one way to look at that.
Yeah, it's our company's mission is just to make it 2%. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Could you? I mean, if you were buying from the freeze packed blueberries, I mean, would that change or alter, the concern for temperature and stuff like that? I mean, what if it like the intermediate step before it came into the winery was it went to the freezer?
We've tried that once and it did not work out. If we failed, we could take steps to give ourselves a better chance of success, but just that the time it took to defrost and then get to a temperature where we could get a healthy fermentation was long, and then that fermentation was not healthy.
Right.
All that the wild yeast was either killed by the freezing or the things that
sleep.
And then the things that were awake sort of when it started to slowly come to temperature were pretty active and ugly.
Right. Not what you wanted.
Yeah, the one winery, the other sort of sparkling blueberry winery in Maine, Bluette, I think they do use some frozen fruit, but I think they basically go straight to a large commercial press and sort of like a press that gets very hot because it's just so active. And I think it sort of presses and defrosts the berries at the same time, but
Got
we
it.
don't sort of have access to that, nor are we sort of interested in that.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So
we should definitely shout out to those guys. I mean, so Bluet, it's Bluet. They were the first to really, attempt a quality-minded wine from wild blueberries, especially sparkling.
Well, let me change gears. Let me ask you, what is it? I mean, I have a couple sort of just final questions. How is it that there could be I mean, why does okay? How do I put this? These are wild blueberries. So when you guys say they're organic fruit, are they actually certifying like an entire farm and then they're just not doing anything to it? So it's essentially what was already there, and now like the owner of that land has certified the land because they can, because they're not doing anything to it? Or how does that work in terms of this interplay between organic and wild? And then I guess the follow-up question to that is, why do you guys care about that? Like, why are you committed to getting only the organic fruit?
Mm. Yeah, so the answer to the first question is I believe that the fruit is wild in that the original plantings happened rather than were done, you know, going
Right.
back to sort of the glaciers retreating, birds dropping seeds, and it happening. So they're wild. They weren't ever planted, but that doesn't mean that the now that the barrens are completely untended. And conventional blueberry growers or raisers are still, well, everyone who's got blueberries encounter risks of pests and other things. So most growers do spray, for instance, with
Oh,
conventional non-organic sprays just to keep pests away, ensure the health
oh.
of the fruit, etc. Um,
Even though
so
it's just even though it's just a wild growing crop.
even though it's a wild growing crop, there are still, there's still, what's the word? I'm coming to like attacks by pests, or animals will come
Yeah.
and eat it. Yeah, susceptible to any number of issues that would reduce your crop, end up with chewed up fruit and all kinds of things like
Huh.
that.
It's just
So
fascinating to think about. Like generally when you think of wild fruit, it's sort of like allowing that ecosystem to have its balance, and you get whatever comes out of it. I've this is the a re- I'm, I don't know. There's something really interesting about this crossover where it is a wild ecosystem, but it's being actively tended.
yeah, it's a good
Uh,
point. Yeah.
and
Uh,
and then yeah, go
yeah.
on.
No. So it's fine. So the growers we work with are certified organic. They're certified by, every state has its organic certification body. They're
Right.
certified by Maine's, and I guess there are some allowed sprays. Of the growers we work with, I think one grower, if absolutely pushed by, that season's vagaries, they will use an allowed organic spray. But for the most part, even they don't. And so there's just a lot of close attention. There's this other sort of fascinating aspect of wild blueberry barrens, which is that any given field only produces fruit every other year. And in the
Huh.
year that it doesn't produce, it is almost always burned, like in a controlled human originating burn. And that does a lot to mitigate some of the pests and other things. So
Huh.
they all burn, and pay a lot of close attention and do all the practices that I guess organic growers of any actually agricultural crop would need to pay attention to. So
That is
wild in
wild.
that it got there without humans starting it all, but not wild in that humans don't pay attention now.
Yeah, that's amazing. I said that's wild, and I was like, well, that's
Yeah,
funny. That's wild. It's Are these practices ones that have been learned from the indigenous folk who were there originally, intended these things originally? I mean, were these kind of controlled burns part of a food system that predated the colonial, like European colonialism?
Yeah, definitely the Native Americans burned fields. Yes, for sure. Um,
That is just something that I'll just chime in on over here about getting back to your question about why are we organic, and like, you
Yeah.
know, exactly how important that is to us.
yeah.
There is certainly, and I guess going way back to the beginning, talking about the market that we all worked at, I think something that we learned there is that organic certification does not necessarily
Mhm.
mean, you know, best practices, and it certainly, a lack of organic certification does not mean that it's not a sustainably raised and cultivated product.
Mhm.
And so while we do have the organic certification now and are working with farms that are organic certified, that's not necessarily something that in the future I think we'll always strictly adhere to. Like, I think there certainly are farms, and in fact, like up north, the Passamaquoddy tribe does cultivate a lot of blueberries and grow blueberries themselves, but aren't organically certified, despite, I think, the science being out there that they do have very sustainable practices and
Right.
use. And so I think that's a conversation that always has to be had, you know, like between us as we grow. You know, we want to support growers that are like stewards of the land, and that looks a lot of different ways and doesn't always necessarily carry the label or certification, at least, of organic.
Yeah.
So just chime in and put that out there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you did. I think that, when we originally were coming to market with a product, we wanted to distinguish ourselves by being certified organic, meaning that we would work with certified organic growers. And in fact, because we add no sulfur, we're not just it's not just wine made with organically grown fruit. It's an organic wine. That's, we can do that according to federal regulations.
Yeah.
But
So the winery is certified?
it is, yes.
Oh, okay, great. I didn't realize that. So you're one of the few.
Yeah, yeah.
um,
Um, but I
wow.
don't
Yeah.
know how
That I
much
was
it actually matters in the end. Like, we talk about it with people, but I don't think people
right.
say, I'm going to buy your wine because it's organic, or the inverse. I'm not going to because it's not. So as Emily,
We
you
haven't
know,
done a focus group.
yeah, exactly.
We haven't you know,
Yeah, right, right.
Well, I'd love to hear what the winery certification is like for you guys. If it's a pain in the butt or what.
I mean, relatively speaking, it's not too bad. I mean, it can be annoying, but
shout out to John at Mazda.
but our process, as you alluded to, is pretty simple considering we are such a simple operation. Uh, when you're
Right.
only bringing in one ingredient and you're adding
Right.
tiny bit of a single ingredient, there isn't a huge amount of certification work that has to go on. So when we first decided, we were like, okay, we'll buy from organic producers. We didn't originally intend to certify the winery, but then as we came closer to sort of releasing our first vintage, decided that if the farmers who are doing a hell of a lot more work than we are, if they take the time to certify their fields, then we thought it would be a sign of respect to at least take the effort on our side to follow
Oh,
through
I
and
love that.
certify
That's
ourselves.
that's a really great perspective. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and
That's
it's
nice.
it's a bit of work, but and yeah, it does cost some money. There's rebates that you get from the federal government for like up to 50% or close to 50% of it, depending on what you spend. So it's a bit of work, but we don't actually know if it, like they said, we don't know if it actually makes a difference on the consumer end. But I think we felt it was
Yeah.
an important role
Well,
step to take.
and this is the one thing I would say is like it probably doesn't make that big of a difference when you're pouring for people when you're interfacing pretty directly with consumers. But if you get to the point where you are distributing and you're in grocery stores around the nation or just not local where people haven't ever heard of you, being able to say organic wine on the label could move the needle for you. It could it could put you into a class of wines in that store where certain consumers only shop, like myself, for example. Not that if I know a vineyard, it doesn't have to say organic wine or made with organic grapes on it. But in the absence of that knowledge, I'm going to limit myself to what I can know. And sometimes it's just that where it's, a producer is taking the time to get certified, and I can see that it's made with organic fruit.
Yeah, I think all that is true. I think that, I mean, and we are, we are distributed in a few other states, and like, um, like we're in New York, we're with Zevrovine, and so obviously,
Right.
perspective is on organically grown fruit among a lot of other things, and so there was a move there. Like, yeah, if we're going to move it beyond sort of shouting distance, then we need to have the message get across, in
Yeah.
those clearer ways. But I also think that it's important. There are people like you, as you just described, like you've already set those criteria for yourself in your buying
Right.
practices. But then there are
Right.
people who have not set those criteria, but I would hope that I could say they have not yet set those criteria for themselves. And the more that they encounter wines where they didn't even go in asking for it, but they just see that it is, then they're like, oh, maybe that's something I should learn about and maybe care about more, And I think that
Yeah.
happened with food to some extent. There's always a sort of early adapters. Um, but but then there comes a point where it's like, well, now I'm not going into Whole Foods. I'm just going into sort of an ordinary supermarket, but there's a pretty significant organic section. And oh, it's really not that much more money. Or maybe it's not any more money. Or maybe I'm willing to pay that extra, you know, 20 cents a pound for broccoli. So then if they're seeing a wine sort of that plays into that as well, it's like, well, you know what? This isn't the weird organic section. This is just what normal wine is. Then we start referring to organic farming as conventional and non-organic
Yeah.
farming as wacko. You know, that's sort of
Right.
a
Right.
multi-year
Yeah.
process, but I do think that that's part of what it is for us.
Yeah, we hope so. I mean, your lips to God's ears, as they say.
Yeah.
I mean, and then I guess the reality is there are still, like a generation older than you guys, probably people who their introduction to organic wine, and we should say this to be able to say organic wine rather than made with organic uh, grapes or fruit, you can't add sulfite, so it has to be a zero sulfur add. And sadly, that led to a lot of, you know,
Mm.
I want to say poor quality wine because I think that's just the truth. But like, if I'm being generous, it's wine that didn't meet the expectations of the average consumer,
Mhm.
and so organic for a generation of people still means just shitty wine, like just
Yeah.
crappy wine that they don't want to drink. And so there is that, sort of echelon of the consuming public to deal with as well when you're considering these choices.
Yeah. True. Yeah.
I mean, that may not be in the places where you're being distributed. If Zev is your distributor, you're probably not in, Ralph's in Los Angeles or wherever,
Yeah.
um,
But
but
as Emily alluded to earlier, like we're with Zev and we're in shops like that, but we're also sort of relying on tourists to some extent for,
right.
so
Yeah.
like we have this sort of split or multifaceted personality. We don't have an average buyer personality. We're trying to
Yeah.
appeal to a lot of different, or at least,
Ha- I, so
until
I
one gets big enough that we don't have to do that anymore.
and we've covered some of that, but I do think that is really a fascinating dilemma. And is there anything that you can say that you haven't said already about that? Because I think that's really true of looking at New England, especially, this is farming country. This is like rural uh, people who, as you said, have been used to sort of sweet wines and that sort of tradition of a conventional style. And more and more, I think some of the most exciting, viticulture and agriculture and winemaking is happening in New England, and it isn't that. It is what you guys are doing, more in that style. And so you have these great coastal markets, but then the local populace and a lot of the tourism does not share that sort of New York, Manhattan natural wine shop vibe. And I mean, have you talked enough about that? Do you have anything else to add about how you guys are thinking about navigating that?
Well, it's interesting because our distributor in Maine really wants us to go really heavy on the blueberry for our label. They're like, this would really help it sell in Maine if you just like made it very obvious that this wine was made with blueberries. So the color of the label, or put a big blueberry on there. And so, and I talked to her this morning, and I was like, it's our ego, but it's just like this balance of like, we want to make something we're proud of and that we believe in and that fits into our life and what we want to drink. But then we also have to sell it, and that means selling to those tourists. And so, like, how do you come, when you're making a label, especially, you get this opportunity to sort of make those decisions, and it's hard to like get over yourselves. Like, you want to make the label that you want to make, but then the people that are selling it have to sell it, and so it's just a struggle to find that balance, which I don't know if we're so good at. I think we're trying to make the coolest label we can think of, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what a blueberry or what somebody from Connecticut who's visiting in the summer will see and say, oh, that's blueberry wine, that's interesting.
Yeah, there are all sorts of,
Gotcha.
it's like, I mean, we even talk about the word wine, and how
Right.
love wine, we think we make a wine that fits into that notion, but it's also like, to what extent do we then bump up against people's, as preconceptions, and they're like, well, this isn't wine, so it's like, should we come up with a word that's like cider for wild blueberries? Like, how do we,
Are
I
there any
guess,
traditional words?
no,
No.
no.
Okay, because yeah, it's like I've same thing here. Like I work with prickly pears, but there's like
Mhm,
an ancient tradition of using those, and it's got lots of different names. Going back even into like indigenous Mexican
mhm.
culture languages.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wonder if you could sort of embrace some traditional thing. But
Yeah, but there
hmm,
is a tradition. I think we'll all look back on this time and see how transitional it was, in terms of nomenclature, in terms of style, in terms of culture and audience finding and all of that. It's just sort of like,
yeah,
a lot of things are being blown apart now in really good ways, but those
yeah.
people haven't yet settled back on Earth. And so it's still a little, and I think that in the thing, to sort of what Dan was saying before, like, in the end, the best decisions we make are the ones we're going to make where we feel proud of it and can stand behind it and not go
Hmm,
chasing some sort of,
yes,
possible, like, market sector, and just be like, this is
right,
who we are, this is what this fruit is, this is what this place we're from is, this is what this
yeah,
wine is, and like,
yeah.
hope.
Yeah,
um
no, and eventually, yeah. I mean, I mean, look, that's. I think there is that. Yeah, I would support that. I think even though, yeah, you might confuse certain elements of the market right now, it's sort of like I'm sure champagne was confusing when it was first
yeah,
invented. And now you have like a global megalith of that region. And yeah, it just takes time. It just takes
yeah,
time, and then people embrace it, and it becomes its own thing. And I think you have a culture there that you're working in. Like you said, there's still this massive untapped potential, 99% of the crop.
yeah,
And yeah, it seems like that could flourish, and Maine would be, yeah, I don't know. So that would be very cool. I
yeah, we'll see.
is I'm guessing is there a viscosity at all? Like, is it sort of like this sparkling wine that you guys make? Is there a texture to it, or is it pretty light even though it's got color?
Mm,
I'd say it's a bit crunchy,
mhm.
Uh-huh.
especially with
Okay.
the acidity being so
Yeah.
high. See, if 2020 with the high acidic more so, but there is definitely like there is a certain texture that's a little sharper, but
Mhm.
so I wouldn't say viscosity, but it's more chewable for sure.
Okay.
The intensity comes in, as you're saying, the color, which is like this deep dark purple, in the aromas, and in some of the actual like flavor notes. But I wouldn't say there's intensity in texture. Like, it's not viscous in that way. It's more like, it's sort of surprisingly light. And it really, I mean, it's listed on the label at 8% alcohol. It's probably, 7 point, I don't know, 8 or something. It's under 8%. So
Yeah.
it doesn't have that viscosity. We should also mention that in addition to Arcadia, which is that dry sparkling wine, which I guess I would say, if you had to do this, I would say is sort of akin to a dry Lambrusco, sort of in style. We do make a fortified aromatized wine,
Yeah.
based in Americano, which is, vermouth-like. There are technical reasons it's not a vermouth, but it's essentially plays like that. And so that, we infuse brandy with herbs and spices and then blend the brandy and it comes up to 12% alcohol. There's more mouthfeel, like more, I don't know. I still don't know if I would use the word viscous, but a rounder mouthfeel in that one.
Got it. Yeah. Nice. And that's not what you think of as a fortified wine alcohol content. So that's still kind of light
Right.
and refreshing, well within like a standard wine
Yeah,
vibe.
exactly.
Sounds lovely.
Yeah.
You have a proprietary blend of aromatics that you use?
We do. That's for that wine that's on the market. I mean, we're happy to disclose the ingredients, but we're also working on other infusions and hoping to broaden
Nice.
that. And yeah. So.
Where do you get your brandy?
From out by you.
Yeah, it's like right down. I think next door to you, actually. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's what's it called?
Wine Secrets.
Wine Secrets. Yeah, it's for the it's a business to business for the industry. Very high proof. It's like 190 or something. 186 proof, clear brandy.
Amazing.
For hazmat shipping to get it over here.
We'd have loved to have bought locally, but
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it sounds like
it's like the vodka brandy. I mean, it's super like neutral.
Gotcha. Yeah. Amazing. All right. Well, guys, this was, super informative. Are there any closing things that you'd like to say? And if, or just, let everybody know where we can find out more about you.
RASWINES.com.
RAS Wines.
RASWines.com. Just doing the spelling. Of course, we're on Instagram at RAS_wine.
Yeah. If you search RAS Wines, you'll find us.
Find us there.
Yeah.
And then, if you live in New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, you can find us
Maine.
And Maine also, yeah. And pretty soon we're actually trying to work on more national distribution. So we've got a number of things coming up soon, I think.
Yeah.
Other places.
And the shameless plug, you can buy our wines on our website.
Yeah, true. The other thing
I noticed that.
That, we did mention it, but we do just totally by luck feel ourselves to be part of this growing community of, non-conventional fermented beverage producers. Specifically, I just want to say a huge thank you to Jade Marley, who has, along with some very strong partners of hers, come up with this ABV, anything but vinifera group. There was a session we were a part of in New York. There's going to be another one in Miami in January. And so all kinds of people out there we're loosely associated with. We're going to be a sort of traveling road show, maybe coming to a town near you sometime soon.
Fantastic. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, guys, very much.
Thank you so much for all your time and questions and attention.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
The sponsor for this episode is Centralis Wine. Centralis is an ecological winery that I started to protect or benefit the environment and my community with every business and winemaking decision. I envision a wine world in which humans are the students and servants of the non-human world, regenerating and protecting the vitality of ecosystems and promoting the diversity of life through wines that uniquely and deliciously reflect local abundance. Centralis wines feature foraged prickly pears, urban perennial polyculture wine garden produced grapes and other fruit, gleanings from urban fruit trees, dry farmed century-old vines, and organic and biodynamic viticulture. If this sounds interesting to you, join our email list or wine club at centraliswine.com. That's CENTRALAS wine.com.